Thank you very much for asking me back again to do another seminar. So yeah, I'm going to be dealing with chapters 71 of 85 of the book. I feel very fortunate that in the way the book's been divided up, I actually get quite a lot of the most interesting parts of the way we live now. And indeed, I'm going to focus on these particularly interesting parts because with sort of excuses galore, I have been a little bit pressed for time lately. So for me, I thought broadly the most interesting parts were Felix's sort of attempted sexual assault on Ruby Ruggles, Melmotte's treatment of Marie Melmotte before trying to force her to sign the documents. Of course, Melmotte's eventual suicide via prussic acid. And finally, the conclusion of Georgiana Longstaff's engagement with Mr. Breggett. So yeah, I thought I would concentrate on these elements of the chapters, although of course there is quite a lot more that goes on here with Hetta, Marie and everybody else, but perhaps we could talk about that in the discussion groups. So firstly, we have Felix's attempts on Ruby Ruggles. John Crumb has come up to London looking for Ruby, and having sought her at Mrs. Pipkin's to no avail, he returns back to his lodgings. However, in one of those nice little novelistic coincidences, he comes upon Ruby and Sir Felix in the street. What I thought was interesting is that I think the first time I read this whole scene kind of passed me by a little bit. Trollope is so sort of subtle and euphemistic in his language that it's sometimes quite difficult to know exactly what is going on here. But rereading it, however, I find myself quite shocked that it passed me by in this way. Trollope tells us that Crumb heard a woman scream, I won't, and that he saw Ruby struggling in a man's arms. Perhaps to our sort of modern eyes, this has a significance that Trollope didn't perhaps intend. But, I do feel even at the time, this is something that would have been seen as being quite sinister. Trollope took pride, as he tells us in his autobiography, in writing books that daughters could read aloud to their fathers. I wonder what sort of conversations were had about this part of the book in drawing rooms. And similarly, I wonder what was said about the next sentence where Trollope tells us that, Ruby had wanted to try her luck back with her aunt, Mrs. Pipkin, but that Felix was of the opinion that he could make a more preferable arrangement for her and had thought a little gentle force might avail him. It seems fairly clear that Felix is trying to coerce Ruby into a sexual relationship of some sort here and is prepared to use violence to achieve that aim. I don't know about anyone else, if anyone else can think, but I can't think of another occasion in a Trollope novel where we have a man attempting to make a woman his mistress in this sort of way, although Trollope does, that does happen in Trollope, but not in this sort of way in the street, forcefully. And sexual matters, of course, are very unusual in Trollope, usually very euphemistically expressed. So I think this is one of those moments for me when you realise how different the way we live now is to other books that Trollope wrote. And I feel that this scene also gives us a new dimension to Felix's character. Up until this point, we might be forgiven for taking him as a sort of idiotic Bertie Wooster type. But this kind of feels like, for me, the point of no return, really. And indeed, his sort of literal disfigurement at the hands of John Crumb has a sort of allegorical significance, I would say. It's sort of like the mark of Cain. And I don't think this is just because of our sort of 21st century views of sexual violence. But I think even for Trollope's audience, I imagine this scene would have been quite shocking. And I think one of the reasons perhaps why it did pass me by the first time, and I think the scene is complicated by Trollope's sort of lightness of touch, the way he approaches it. John Crumb intervening in this way and obviously sort of beating Felix to a pulp, essentially, remind me of, Frank Gresham whipping Mr. Moffat in Dr. Thorne, and also Johnny Eames thrashing Crosby in The Small House at Allington. I think Trollope clearly enjoys writing these sorts of scenes. And I think one of the reasons I would describe Trollope as quite a complicated writer is that despite his sort of obvious and deeply held beliefs in, fairness and justice and the largely sort of civilizing properties of institutions like the law and the civil service, obviously, on the other hand, he is quite enthusiastic about this sort of vigilante justice. And I think it's important to note too, like here, and also there's two other instances, none of these instances are exactly a fair fight. Crumb comes at Felix from behind. Frank ambushes Moffat outside the club. And I believe, I was trying to look for it today, but I couldn't find it, but I believe Eames comes up behind Crosby from behind at the railway station. You know, and I think it's kind of interesting because I think considering the sort of importance of the chivalric code, if you like, in this book, particularly around sort of Roger Carberry as the sort of moral centre, I find it interesting that Trollope sort of chooses to have the justice dispensed and resolved in this sort of way. I think possibly what we're meant to infer is that, you know, where a woman's honour is concerned, as is the case in all of these three instances, the normal rules don't apply, and that clearly interfering with a woman romantically in some sense is one of the deepest crimes a character can commit in the Trollope universe. So I thought that was quite interesting, and hopefully maybe give us something, a little something to sort of talk about there. And it does, you know, lead quite nicely into my next section. So upon Marie's refusal to sign the documents of the money that's in her name, which would release the money held in her name and enable her father's shaky house of cards to stay standing a little bit longer, Melmotte commences to beat her. Trollope gives us a Greek quote, which translates as, "Let not Medea with unnatural rage slaughter her mangled infants on the stage," and then adds, "Nor will I attempt to harrow my reader by a close description of the scene which followed. Poor Marie, that cutting up into tiny pieces was commenced after a most savage fashion. Marie, crouching down, hardly uttered a sound." And again, I can't think of another example in a Trollope novel particularly of something like this happening before. Yet in The Way We Live Now, these sorts of things are kind of ubiquitous. We remember Ruby's grandfather also thrashed her for refusing to comply with his demands earlier in the book. And we are told early on that Lady Carberry's former husband used to strike her often. I thought, again, perhaps something for the discussion groups, but I can't help but feel that what Trollope is sort of driving at here is that with these things is that the way we live now of the title is one where sort of violence, and particularly violence against women, is seen as a legitimate way to right wrongs and ensuring that women comply with the demands of men. So I thought that would be quite interesting, or see what people think. With some of this, you do tend to play devil's advocate a little bit. So, you know, I'm happy if people disagree, of course. But so now sort of changing tack a bit. So I thought I'd talk about Melmotte's suicide. I think the fact that Trollope chooses to remove Melmotte from the action at the novel's close in this way is actually quite a significant choice. With his schemes about to be exposed and confronted with financial and social ruin, Melmotte, alone and drunk in his study, drinks a lethal dose of prussic acid. Pointedly, I think, Trollope initially intended for Melmotte's downfall to be exposed through a trial. I think I might have said this before, but I think it's important, so I'll say it again. But it's both through a public trial. However, at some point during the composition, Trollope changes his mind and has Melmotte commit suicide instead. One critics claim that this change was for the reasonably straightforward reason that he'd used trial scenes in 3 of the last 4 books that he'd written, and that he required more flexibility in the other subplots for the subplots of the novel that a lengthy trial sequence would have detracted from. However, the change is more deliberate, I think, and in keeping with the overall sort of pessimistic tone of the book than merely Trollope changing it for sort of practical reasons. I think a public trial would have allowed sort of this society to sort of examine fully the extent to which Melmotte was a product of that society, the society that had fostered him in this way. By having him retreat privately from the action through suicide, Trollope robs the reader and the characters of the opportunity for this sort of much needed reflection and catharsis. The use of suicide compounds the idea that Melmotte is merely a sort of oddity here, allowing society to take the erroneous message that Melmotte is merely, to quote one critic, a freak whose freakishness is no longer as repulsive as it should be. I wondered what other people thought about that. So yeah, mine's quite a short talk. So finally, I'd like to have a look at the conclusion of Georgiana Longstaff's engagement with Mr. Breguet. The letters are quite light, and I think actually at this point in the book, it makes quite a nice change of page to have a sort of epistolary chapter and change of pace, particularly given what's sort of come before. So Georgiana, bless her, can't even pretend that she's interested in anything other than Mr. Breguet's wallet. and insists upon him providing a house in town for her, despite his protestations that he cannot afford it. To her surprise, he finds this very offensive and calls the engagement off. Trollope tells us, she so fully recognised her own value as a Christian lady of high birth and position, giving herself to a commercial Jew, that she thought that under any circumstances Mr. Breggett would be only too anxious to stick to his bargain. I thought this quote particularly, I thought this rather neatly sort of summarised what I'd say is one of the big themes of the book, that everyone and everything now has become a market, where even love and intimacy are reduced to sort of marketable goods to be valued and weighed up. I've recently finished Edith Horton's The House of Mirth, which I'm a little bit obsessed with at the moment, but who deals with this theme, particularly this sort of theme, sort of exclusively. I was also surprised to find in that book a sort of similar parallel between Lily Bart, the main character, and Simon Rosedale, where she's a Christian girl, she nearly becomes engaged to a Jewish financier, but it's sort of broken off at the last minute when her societal value kind of depreciates. Controversially, it did make me wonder if that is an element of what's going on here between Georgiana and Mr. Breggett. And as I mentioned last week, what I do find surprising is why on earth Breggett would have been attracted to Georgiana in the first place. As Trollope says of her, she was herself not very highly born, nor very highly gifted, nor very lovely, nor very pleasant, and she had no fortune. I think what's difficult here, because you are sort of trying to read between the lines, because so much of their engagement has happened kind of off scene. We sort of hear about it, then we have the letter, but there's not the actual crunch of when they actually get to know one another. But I think perhaps it's reasonable to think that one of her attractions to him might be the access to a different social circle, and perhaps an eagerness on his part to withdraw from the engagement is not merely just because of her mercenary remarks, but perhaps a realization that actually what she offers in return now has dwindled, given that her, her family, and perhaps we may infer, her sort of friends more broadly, want nothing more to do with her. I wanted to add too that I sort of feel a bit sort of controversial saying this, but I feel personally discussions around Mr. Breggett in The Way We Live Now sometimes feel quite kind of loaded. I feel it's perhaps tempting, I certainly do it, I feel it's quite tempting to turn to Mr. Breggett as a sort of clear example when critics disparage Trollope for his anti-Semitism that's present in the books. I'm not really quite sure that Mr. Breggett is a sort of saviour here, really fits with the pervading sort of gloom of the book. And I'm perhaps inclined to think that Trollope is trying to show us that public life has gotten into a bad way indeed when the only honourable man in London is a Jewish banker. I am to a degree sort of playing devil's advocate there, but I thought perhaps there's something to think about there, and hopefully provoke some discussion points. So yeah, very brief, but thank you very much for inviting me to speak today.